The old folks say that anyone can go insane, given enough time and isolation. It's easy to call someone crazy when they live alone, far away from everything and everyone, when they never let anyone in. But what happens when being alone drives you to do things you never thought possible? What happens when your only company is the creeping dread in your mind? Welcome to my channel. Today, I will tell you the story of the haunted house where the cats return. This happened in a village, not too far away, yet so far removed from the world that for simplicity's sake, I'll call it nowhere. In nowhere, houses stood empty, businesses shut their doors early, and children were told to stay away from the edge of town. It was almost like everyone in nowhere was scared of something. There was a man in nowhere named Silas. He lived in a house on the outskirts of town, halfway between the road and the woods. He had a picket fence around his yard, which was full of dead weeds and overgrown bushes. His porch was creaky, and his front door was almost always locked. He had windows on either side of it, but they were covered in heavy drapes that never moved even in the wind. If he wasn't expecting company, then no one ever visited him, okay? And if he wasn't looking for company, then he never left his house, okay? To this day, no one knows how long he lived there or why he chose such a life. But over time, the townsfolk came up with theories. What drew most people to Silas's house was the flickering of candlelight. They could see it through the gaps in his curtains, even during the day. That was the only time they ever saw him. His gaunt figure moving from room to room, casting flickering shadows on the wall. The townsfolk would whisper to each other about what kind of person he was to spend all his days indoors. And before long, more stories started to take root. Stories of missing pets and a strange man in nowhere. It started with just cats. People would wake up and find their beloved felines gone. One minute they were there, purring on the rug or curled up on the windowsill. The next, they disappeared without a trace. Sometimes a pet would come back, shaken and anxious, but they didn't know where they'd been or why they were gone. Other times, nothing was ever seen or heard again. People were scared, confused, and desperate for answers. But in nowhere, you never got answers. You only got fears. One night, while walking home from work, a woman was cornered by 3 large dogs. She screamed, flailed, and fought, but it was untent until she spotted a familiar figure at the edge of the street that her attackers ran off. When she turned to thank him, she saw that it was Silas, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. All he did was nod slightly and disappear into the gloom. The woman never saw him again, but she also never forgot the look in his eyes. It was as though he were looking into her soul and finding something he liked better than her own. Then another animal vanished. This time it was a dog, a large Doberman. He was playing in the yard when he suddenly bolted across the street and into Silas's garden. Cable searched everywhere, called his name until their voices were hoarse, but they never found him. Even the bloodhound couldn't pick up his scent, because it was swallowed up by something else, something foul and cloying. From then on, people were afraid to even walk past Silas's house. They couldn't help themselves from peering at his dark windows, convinced that they'd glimpse something horrible on the other side, but all they ever saw was more darkness. That was when the whispers started. The townspeople didn't need proof to know that Silas was bad news. Their instincts told them he was dangerous, and it was enough. They gossiped about him on street corners, told stories of his supposed crimes, and blamed him for all their woes. But in reality, none of them knew what horrors lay behind his doors. This continued for years. Children were born and died, and still no one stepped foot on Silas's property. His house remained empty, overrun by weeds and draped in shadow. And that's how it stayed until one winter night, when a group of teenagers dared to trespass. They broke in through a basement window, armed with flashlights and bravado, ready to face any danger. But what they found wasn't danger, it was horror. As their flashlights cut through the dust-filled air, they saw that the basement was occupied. There were shelves upon shelves of cat food lining the walls, along with dozens of empty litter boxes. As they made their way deeper into the basement, they discovered cages filled with torn cushions and scraps of fabric. It looked like a butcher shop, but instead of meat, they were dealing with cat toys. And then they heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the dark. They turned and ran, stumbling out of the house and never looking back. No one knows what exactly they saw or heard, but they swore they would never go near Silas's house again. Some say they saw ghostly cats with glowing eyes watching them from the stairs. Others say they heard disembodied meows echoing through the halls. Whatever they encountered, it was enough to drive them mad. And soon, the nightmares began. Every night, they dreamt of claws tearing at their skin, of fangs dripping with venom, and of eyes that burned with hatred. When they woke, they could feel their sheets tangled around their limbs like grasping claws, as if something had reached out from beneath their beds and tried to drag them down. Terrified, they threw their doors open to make sure they were alone, only to find that their rooms were empty. But the feeling of being watched remained. Silas himself seemed to shrink away from the world. He kept his curtains drawn day and night, his windows sealed with thick blankets. Whenever anyone passed by his house, he would bolt upright at his window and stare out at them with wild eyes. Then he would vanish. But the townsfolk weren't done. Whispers turned to shouts, suspicion to accusation. And one day, someone decided to put an end to this charade. They marched on Silas's house, determined to force him to come outside. But before they could reach his door, they were met with a sight that made them stop dead in their tracks. The front door was wide open. Hesitantly, they stepped inside and found that the house was empty. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken windows. Everything was eerily silent. The only sound they could hear was the pounding of their own hearts. They called out to Silas, but only their own voices echoed back at them. Some of the townsfolk wanted to tear the house down, to get rid of the looming structure once and for all. But others thought it was a bad idea. They pointed out that the house had been there for decades, and nothing had ever happened before. Besides, what if Silas returned and found his house destroyed? He decided to leave it be. But they also decided to seal off the house and turn the key. No one would ever enter it again. Decades passed, and Silas's house remained untouched. If you wander through nowhere, you'll see that the streets are lined with new houses and smiling faces. But if you look closely, you'll notice that one street is blocked off, the road leading to Silas's house overgrown and crumbling. No one dares go there anymore, except for the cats. They slink through the underbrush, their eyes gleaming with a feral light. Locals claim to hear their eerie meows echoing from the house at night. And sometimes, when the moon is full, they can even be seen sprinting across the road and disappearing inside a car. So whenever you hear the mournful cry of a cat in the dead of night, remember that it could be the ghost of a cat haunting the house where the cats return.